Hey there, it's Sam. So in the previous lesson, we learned about API and HTTP, but we haven't really gone through how to use API in JavaScript yet. Here's the app that we'll be building by the end of this lesson, using Web API. This is a very useful app for us to answer yes or no questions. Let's try it out. We'll ask a question, and the computer will decide for us. Let's try it one more time. Bam! We get a no again. Okay, let's give it another try for one last time. Damn, it is smart. So before we dive into the code, I want to quickly introduce you on how to send out HTTP requests using JavaScript. So that's this API here that will fetch us all sort of information about the latest status of COVID-19 across the globe. And here's the documentation. The link is in the description if you're interested. Let's use this API for our little demonstration here. We'll try to call this country's endpoint. So I'll copy this link. And now let's go to VS Code. We'll create a new variable for this API endpoint. The browser has offered us a very simple way to send out HTTP requests using the fetch function. The fetch function accepts two arguments. The first argument is the API endpoint, so I'm going to pass in URL in there. And the second argument is the option for our API request. So the options include the method of our HTTP request, which in our case here will be a GET request. So I just need to put in the string GET. We'll also put in the headers, which will be telling the server that we only want to accept JSON response. There are other options available. The documentation again is attached in the description below. Now the fetch function is an asynchronous operation and it will return us a promise. So to handle the response, we'll need to call the .then function on the promise. And the callback function accepts one argument, which is the raw response of the API, represented by a special response object. We know that this API is returning us a JSON body. So to read the response object in JSON format, we'll need to call the JSON function on the response object. The JSON function here, again, is returning us another promise, and we'll pass a result to the next then. Let's console log out the response, and we'll see it inside the browser. And we get a massive array with 248 elements in it, which is the expected API response, as written in the documentation. And from line 21 and onwards, it will be up to us to do whatever we want on the data that we got from the API response. The possibilities are endless. We could build a chart to display all this data, or to build a travel app that indicates how safe a country is if we were to travel to there. Okay, now that we know how to use a fetch function, let's build our decision-making app. First of all, let's put down our layout. We'll need a form for the question input, and we'll put down a label and the input element with an ID of task. And inside the label, we'll put down the heading for our input. Let's see how it looks like in the browser. Looking good. We'll put in some placeholder for the input field as well. Our form is aligned to the left at the moment, which is not that great. Let's center it with Flexbox. We'll create a few helper CSS classes. dFlex to set the display property to flex so that we can create a flex container. Justify center to center items on the main axis. FlexCol to set a flex direction to column. And align center to center items on a cross axis. And now let's apply our helper classes on the form. We'll make it a flex container and set a flex direction to column to align the items vertically. And then we'll apply our align center class to center the items on the cross axis, which is on the horizontal axis. Let's test it. Looking great. After the form, we need a place to display our result. We'll create a new section and give it a class of image container. Within the section, we'll put an article to display the yes or no image. And after that, we'll have a h1 to display the word yes or no. And that is our basic layout. Let's start writing our JavaScript now. Before we move on, let me show you the API that we're going to use in this app. It's a website called yesno.wtf. So the idea is, every time we refresh the page, this website is going to give us either yes, no, or maybe, depending on our luck. And if you look on the lower left corner, they do provide us an API, which is exactly what we're going to use in this lesson. So this is a GET request with the URL of /API. Let's store this URL as a variable in our script so we can reference it later. Next, before we start coding, let's write down our story, or the pseudocode for our app. Here's the plan. When the user types in a question in the input and hit enter, we should then call the API. Once the request is completed, then we'll display the result in the image article and the answer text element. So first of all, let's add an event listener to the form element. We'll listen to the submit event and we'll create a handler function called decide. Inside the decide function, the first thing we want to do is to call the prevent default function to stop the page from refreshing from the submit event. Since we have an input inside the form element, every time the user hit enter, it will trigger the submit event on the form, and that will trigger our decide event listener. Next, we'll try to call the API. So I'm going to call the fetch function and pass in a WTF URL with some options. Method will be get, and headers will be accept JSON. Next, in the then function, we will retrieve our API response and store it inside a variable called result. Response.json is returning us a promise, and we're using the async and await keyword here to make our code a little bit cleaner, so we don't need to change the result to the next then. The result object contains 3 fields: answer, false, and image. We should put the image property inside an image element and load it to the DOM. So let's create an image element, set a source attribute to the image property in the result, and put it into image article. We also want to put the answer property into the answer text element. So let's do that as well. Alright, let's test our code. Whoops, I've got a typo there. Let's try it one more time. Boom, it's working. Let's give it another try. And that's an issue. The new image is appended to the DOM without clearing the existing image. Let's fix that. So before we call the API, we should really clear out any existing content within our image article element and the answer text element. We can do that easily by setting the inner HTML property to an empty string. And now it's working fine. But it takes a few seconds for us to get the result from the API. In other words, the user needs to wait for a few seconds after hitting enter on the input field. Let's set up some sort of loader during the waiting time. I'll put in a new article element and have a heading says let me think in there. And by default, we should hide this element. So let's create a new class called hide. And I'll set the display property to none. Next, we'll create some helper function to show this thinking element or to hide this thinking element. In the show thinking function, we'll simply remove the hide class from the class list of thinking article. In contrast, in the hide thinking function, we'll add the hide class to the class list of thinking article. And then, before we call the API, we should call the show thinking function to show the loader. And when the API call is finished, we'll then call the hide thinking function. Let's test our code. And the thinking heading is showing. Functionality-wise, our app is completed, but it looks very ugly at the moment. Let's style it. First of all, let's change our background color and also the font. We'll target the body element, change the font family, and make a dark theme background with white text. Next, we'll style the input. First of all, change the background color to transparent, and we'll give it a default border of 1 pixel solid. And we'll set the font color to this grayish purple, and set the font size to large. Give it a little bit of breathing space by setting the padding to 10 pixel, and also increase the width to 500 pixel. When the input is focused, we also want to increase the border width and change the border color to slightly lighter. And also remove the outline. Next, we should make the result center and also the thinking loader center. To do that, we just need to add our helper classes to the image container element. Set it to flex and also justify center. Working great. But now we do want our answer text to sit on top of our image. To do that, we can make its position absolute and set the position of our image container to be relative, so the absolute position of answer text is relative to this image container. And we'll also make the answer text uppercase by setting the text transform property to uppercase. Let's test our code. Working great. And one last thing, let's just add a little bit of space on the top of our image container. I'll set margin top to be 50 pixels and give it a final run. Everything looks great. So that's a quick intro on how we can send API requests in JavaScript using the fetch function. It is a very useful function, and we'll be using it more in a future lesson when we get to learn to build our own API server. If it doesn't make sense to you, feel free to rewatch the video or visit the documentation. The link is again in the description. Key takeaway for this lesson: we use the fetch function to send HTTP requests in JavaScript. The fetch function accepts two arguments. The first argument is the API endpoint, in other words, the URL that we want to send the request to. The second argument is an object that represents the options related to the request. The fetch function returns us a promise, which means it is an asynchronous operation, and we should call the .then function to handle the response of the API. That's it for this lesson, and I will see you again in the next video. If you enjoyed the content of this video, don't forget to hit the like, subscribe, and the bell icon for more content to come. It will really help me out. Thanks for the support.